Trifles, Justified Murder by Robert Gallimore. John Wright, victim or abuser? This is what we know about the husband John. He is described a cold, hard man in the play. He was a hard man, Mrs. Peters, just to pass the time of day with him, shivers, like a raw wind that gets cold to the bone. There are signs of domestic abuse at the house as well as a dead canary, which was strangled by Mr. Wright. Not much is known about Mrs. Wright. Minnie Wright is described in the play as a bird, timid and fluttery. 20 years with a man like Mr. Wright would cause her to change, but what could cause someone like this to resort to murder? The men. The men in the play are pretty flat characters. They're not described too well by the author, but they're important nonetheless. Henry Peters is the local sheriff, while George Henderson is the county attorney who would serve as the prosecution attorney if she went to trial. While Lewis Hale is just a farmer who first saw the body of Mr. Wright. And all of them are trying to find evidence to convict Mrs. Wright of murder or to find evidence that of someone else. They all have a condescending attitude towards the women, and this causes them to overlook crucial details that would have enabled them to find the motive if they had treated the women as equals. So what could the motive be? What could have drives a timid woman such as Mrs. Wright to murder? After 20 years of hard work on the farm, domestic abuse and loneliness would obviously change her, so she wouldn't be the same timid, fluttery bird that she used to be. It's my belief that John Wright drove his wife to murder by isolating her from her friends and depriving her of the beauty of the song of her canary. Mr. Wright's murder of her canary wasn't the reason that she murdered him, but it was the final act of abuse that triggered her fighting back. After all the long years of being lonely, when she finally obtains something that takes her out of this trance-like state where she just kind of goes day by day suffering, and she remembers what it's like to be happy again. It's when that's taken away, she can't handle it anymore. She doesn't want to go back to the horrible day by day life where she just kind of just is there like a fly on the wall. And that's what triggers her to that's when she realizes that she just can't do it. She has to kill him. She can't go back to being that way. And it ends up either being her or him, and the most reasonable choice for survival is obviously him. There are many signs of abuse throughout the play, such as the damaged birdcage and strangled canary, the general description of her husband from her friends. And when I look at the store, it's broke, one hinge pulled apart. Looks as if someone must have been rough with it, which is the damaged door. Abusers very commonly isolate the abusee or the victim. There is usually a sense of isolation, with the woman not being allowed to speak with her friends or children. This brings us to the two women of the play, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Peters is described as a slight, wiry woman with a thin, nervous face. She has only been in town for a few years, so she doesn't really understand the full culture of the town yet and how they run. She is, however, married to the sheriff and therefore prefers to follow the law. But she does understand the loneliness of being a female domestic housewife. And because of this, she can relate to Mrs. Wright, and this influences her decision later on, which is the decision to withhold the evidence from her husband. Mrs. Hale is very different from Mrs. Peters. She's of a heavier build and has lived in the town her entire life, so she really knows how the town works. She is used to how men treat women, and she resents them for it. She resents how men in general for the treatment that of her gender. And she was friends with Minnie Wright as a child, and this means that she's a reliable source when she describes Minnie as a bird, timid and fluttery, when she was young. She's married to a farmer named Lewis Hale, and this means that she understands what it's like to work on a farm. She understands the hard work and the loneliness and probably the general resentment that her husband might feel towards her, because she gets to do as a woman, she gets to do the easier jobs such as milking cows and doing the housework inside, while the husband is out in the hot sun all day. And they can come inside and be very aggressive because they think that the woman has just had a wonderful day sitting in the house, when really it's not like that at all. And Mrs. Hale really understands this and how men can be towards women. Evidence withholding. Mrs. Hales and Mrs. Peters discover many items that could help convict Minnie Wright of murder, but they choose not to share, and why should they? The men laugh at them, thinking that they are just fooling around with silly woman trifles, such as sewing and cleaning, when in reality they're noticing the signs that Minnie Wright wasn't really in her right mind when she did that night. That it's more obvious that she probably did kill him, but no one understands a woman's mind better than another woman, and the men don't see this or ask for their help. They just let them gather her things around the house, when really they're noticing everything that was wrong in the house, or wrong with Mrs. Wright. They noticed a variety of items, such as the untidy house, which is a sign that maybe Mrs. Hale wasn't doing all of her work as a housewife, and this might have been a trigger to make her husband angry, which might have been the trigger for her to damage the birdcage and strangle the canary. And this would have led to, this obviously would have been extremely distressful for Mrs. Wright. And this would have caused her to become extremely nervous as she planned out how she was going to murder him, because she could no longer put up with her husband treating her this way. And maybe this caused her nervous stitching in the quilt. And Mrs. Hale notices this and realizes that this could be a link to the crime, because obviously something was wrong with Mrs. Hale. That's why she was stitching, because a woman that has been stitching her entire life doesn't just stitch incorrectly. And the women know this, but the men don't notice this, because they don't treat the women respectfully, and they don't try to think as a woman. And Mrs. Hale decides to unstitch this and fix the quilt, thereby deleting the evidence. But it's also a key detail. But the string canary is also, they also hide the string canary, which is a key detail in linking the strange murder method, because the canary was strangled, It was wrung by the neck. And so was her husband, Mr. Wright, was strangled with rope. Time period. In this time period, there were very few options for women. Women could not legally divorce their husbands. They could hold jobs, but they were paid far less, and it would be extremely hard for a woman to support herself if she did somehow manage to leave. Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale understood this, and that's why they withheld the information, because there was no other way to escape her abusive husband. Minnie Wright should be acquitted for the murder of her husband, John Wright, for the following reasons. Mrs. Wright had no other way to escape the abuse. If she had run away, it would have most likely resulted either in her death because she couldn't survive alone in that time period, or being caught and brought back home to her husband, who would severely punish her. It's important to know that she didn't kill him because of the canary, but that the canary brought joy back to her and made her realize that there was more to life. And when he took that away from her, she realized that she couldn't go back and live that way anymore. So it wasn't because of the canary, it wasn't revenge for the canary, but it was a trigger. The death of Mr. Wright would enable Mrs. Wright to inherit his property, and with this, she could be independent. So with his death, she could continue to live, because women were allowed to inherit property after the year 1857, which the story takes place post 1857, or was written post 1857 at least. Therefore, this was the only action that would have enabled her to live a somewhat comfortable life. And by comfortable, I mean with the basic necessities that a human being needs to feel safe. Shelter, a steady supply of food, not worrying about being picked up off the side of the street and just taken somewhere to become a slave or killed.